The following talk was given at the Insight Meditation Center in Redwood City, California. Please visit our website at audiodharma.org.
And tonight I thought I would explore the topic of working with thinking, working with thoughts. And, often the initial instructions we get when we start meditating are to set the thoughts aside and come back to the breath or come back to something in the present moment. And yet thoughts are something happening in the present moment. And so I think the idea that we offer, especially at the beginning, is that thoughts are particularly challenging things to be mindful of, because I think very habitually they have a strong delusive tendency to them. They have a tendency to have us believing their reality. When we get lost in a thought of the past, it's as if we are living in that world for those few minutes when we are thinking about that. When we get lost in thoughts of the future, we are constructing some reality, and we're kind of living in that world for those times. And so we lose touch with the fact that what's actually happening is that the mind is doing this thinking process in the present moment. It's thinking about thoughts of the past, and that's happening now. It's thinking about thoughts of the future, and that's happening now. So the habit that we have around thinking is a strong habit of not being mindful. But it's not inherent in thinking that we cannot be mindful of it. And so this is the terrain I'd like to explore today. First of all, how to work with thoughts a little bit, how to begin to become aware while thinking. Thoughts are not our enemy in meditation. They are simply another phenomenon, much as the eye sees, the ear hears, the nose smells, the tongue tastes, the body experiences touch. The mind thinks. And there's a difference, I think, a little bit in the experience of thinking and the experience of seeing, in that we think of our eye as being part of us, and the sights are something not part of us. And so it's like we're seeing something out there, or we're hearing something out there. And with the mind, what the mind is doing is both producing thoughts, emotions, and receiving them. So it's doing both, and that's, I think, some of the place where we get a little confused. It's like, how can I be aware of thinking while I'm thinking? Isn't the mind doing the thinking while it's thinking, and that it can't be aware while it's thinking? But there is this capacity. There's different processes of mind. The process of awareness and knowing what's happening in the present moment is a different process from a process of thinking. So it is possible, I'll just say that to start with, it is possible to be aware of thinking. And so to just begin to explore this. I think also we tend to think that a meditation is better when we're not thinking. We may have a sense of our mind getting quiet sometimes in meditation. If we do the practice of just coming back to one object, one experience, like the breath, it does tend to reduce thoughts, and it actually feels pretty good to have the mind be quiet. Part of the reason it feels good isn't so much about there being no thoughts, but it's about being present. That's a lot of the reason why it feels good, is because our system actually likes being in the present moment. And very often thinking does take us out of the present moment. So what the fundamental thing we need to begin to understand with thought is that there's a vast difference between being lost in thought or following thinking, going along with thinking, and knowing that thinking is something that's happening in the present moment. Waking up to the fact that thinking is happening. There's a vast difference between those two. When we are following the thinking, we are usually unaware that we're in the present moment. We're in the reality that the thought has created, and so we've left the present moment. So there's a vast difference between knowing that you're thinking in the present moment and being lost in that thinking. When we are lost in thinking, when we're following the thinking, very often our subconscious tendencies come into play. You know, when we're lost in a story of the past, for instance, replaying a conversation that we had with somebody, maybe it was a contentious conversation. You know, we're lost in that world, and our habits, our patterns, the ways that we respond to those situations when we're lost in it tend to happen again. And so I mentioned in the meditation that if we get lost in thought while we're meditating, very often when we wake up to that, there's a different climate, there's a different landscape that's happening in this moment, because while we're lost in thought, often our habits, our tendencies just start to come into play. So if we are thinking about a conversation we had with somebody that was a little bit contentious, and we remember something they said in that memory, it's likely to trigger kind of habitual reactions, as if we are experiencing that interchange all over again. And it's not the case, actually. This is something that's useful to begin to know about thoughts. It's not the case that the thought inherently has all of those reactions to it. So when we remember thinking about somebody, an interchange from the past that was a little bit charged, the charge isn't inherent in that memory. It's actually recreated now, because our habits and patterns are being triggered again. And so this is one of the powerful pieces of becoming mindful of our thoughts, that as we start to wake up to thinking is happening, there's the possibility of not just going down the garden path of our habitual tendencies, but beginning to make different choices in our minds. So there's the possibility of making different choices of how do we respond. And one of those choices can be, maybe it would be useful to be mindful of this. Maybe it'd be useful to be mindful of this experience that's been created because the mind has been thinking. So I want to talk about, today, I'm thinking of doing a conversation about working with thinking over a couple of nights, at least 2, if not more. Tonight I'd like to explore kind of the inner landscape of working with thoughts when we're in meditation, when we're by ourselves. And then in subsequent evening, I'd like to talk about working with thinking in the midst of having conversations with people and engaging in the world, because that is really where some of the power of working with thoughts can begin to manifest. When we are aware that we're thinking in daily life and can make choices in the midst of our engagement with people. And tonight I'd like to talk about just getting familiar with thoughts, getting familiar with what it means to be aware of thinking. And the first place that's useful to do that is often in our meditation. Sometimes I use an analogy about working with thoughts. If we want to learn how to play a difficult game like basketball, we want to learn how to do that. We're probably not going to start by putting ourselves into the middle of a professional basketball game. That would be like disaster. What we'd start doing is getting some lessons, learning how to play the game, and practicing on our own. spending time dribbling, shooting baskets. That's where we'd begin. And then maybe move into playing one-on-one with a friend who's not going to be mean to us and push us over. And then maybe pickup game with friends. So we learn the skills. And very similarly with being practicing with thoughts, kind of moving towards practicing in the world, the basic skills that we start with, we can learn in the silence of our meditation. That's where we can start by learning, what does it mean? How can we actually be aware of thinking when we're not in the midst of a challenging negotiation? So what I'd like to talk about tonight is kind of two flavors of thinking that happen for us. Especially in our meditation, we have, I would just roughly call it two kinds of thinking. One is, and this is a different cut than the Buddha did when he talked about two kinds of thought, but there's a kind of thought where the mind charges out of the present moment, where there's something that we pick up on and the mind is really interested in thinking about that. And it's often about our lives, it's about our relationships, it's about who we are, what we do. Very much the story of me is right in the front and center of that. And so there's that kind of thinking, very active kind of thinking. I sometimes say it's like, the mind charges out of the present moment with that kind of thinking. And then there's another kind of thinking, which I hope I'll have time to talk about tonight too, that we begin to notice in our meditation in particular. I don't think I did notice this before I started meditating. That sometimes you can put your mind into a kind of a space of relaxation where it's not like actively thinking, but it's more drifting. We may get into this kind of space before falling asleep at night, or if you just are daydreaming or staring out the window, just a kind of drifting kind of state. It's not like anything is catching us or picking up on, there's not a strong emotional charge, but it's just a drift out of the present moment. That often happens in meditation, especially as the mind gets more calm. As the mind settles down and gets more calm, it's almost like the energy of the meditation isn't quite strong enough to keep our minds present, and so there's just this drifting out of the present moment. Often, one of the ways that you can one of the things that you can notice as a difference between these two is in the moment when you wake up from thinking, in the moment when you remember. Mindfulness returns, that moment of mindfulness returning. And this is the place to begin, I think, all of our exploration around working with thought, is noticing the moment when mindfulness returns. Because often in that time, not always by any means, but often the mind has been lost in thought when the mind returns from wandering. And so that's a moment when we can begin to get a flavor of what does it mean to actually be mindful of thinking. Because often in that moment when mindfulness returns, what we're waking up to is the thinking. And so right there, we see the possibility of being mindful of thinking. A distinction between these two kinds of thinking can be seen in that moment often, at least in my own experience. And this is from my experience. This is not something that I read in the Buddha's teachings, but it seems a very useful exploration, and so I offer it to you. That if the mind has charged out of the present moment and has been lost in some kind of either a reactive kind of pattern, like we're thinking about something that we're mad about or frustrated about or angry about or wanting things to be different, or perhaps something we're excited about or wanting to have happen. So we have that kind of charge. There's a kind of an energetic experience that happens with those thoughts. When we wake up and notice we've been thinking in that kind of a situation, there's often a bodily experience of energy. It may feel like a contracted energy, it might feel like an agitated energy, an excited energy, it may feel like there's an emotion connected to it. But in that moment when mindfulness returns, there is some kind of a shift. It's like there's a noticeable shift sometimes from where we were before the mind wandered and where we are after the mind wandered. And so in that moment of waking up, it's really useful to notice that, as opposed to having the idea of jumping over, well, I've been thinking, so what I want to do is come back to the breath. Or what I want to do is come back to feeling the body. It's like what's actually happening in that moment is that there's a lot of energy and maybe some emotions that are present. And so taking some time when you wake up to take in, how am I now, in this moment, having been thinking? So be curious about that. Not having any sense of idea of it's a problem that you've been thinking, but that happened. We have no control over that part, actually. Nothing different to do about that. And the moment when mindfulness returns, we've got the possibility to engage in a new way. And it's like, oh, here I am. Here's the mindfulness, and this is what's happening. Often checking into how the body is. Is the body tense? More tense than it was? Is there emotion happening? Are there bodily experiences of the emotion? So just checking in for yourself. And I think one of the keys there, a simple thing to check into, is there tension? Is there kind of a sense of unpleasant agitation or tension in the body when you wake up from thinking? If so, it's really useful to take the time to relax again. Relax the body, relax the mind, before trying to do anything more at that point. And so, if the mind has been doing that active thinking, that charge out of the present moment thinking, in the moment of waking up, often there is a kind of attention that's present. If the mind has been doing drifting thinking, on the other hand, what I often find in my experience is that when the mind wakes up to that kind of thinking, often it feels pleasant. The mind is actually kind of relaxed and at ease, because there is not particularly anything the mind has gotten hooked to. It's just kind of drifted. And when the mindfulness wakes up to that drifting, it's almost like sometimes we can, in that moment, connect to the relaxation that's happened as a result of the drifting. Make use of that. Sometimes when the mind drifts, it's finding its way to more relaxation. And so if we have the idea that all thinking is a problem when we wake up, and if we judge ourselves when we wake up and recognize that we were thinking, we will miss completely the fact that actually the mind is more relaxed than it was. Sometimes I've seen in my practice that especially when I'm trying really hard, if I'm like really churning, it's like, yep, I'm going to be mindful, I'm going to pay attention, I'm going to be aware of every breath. Sometimes the mind will wander. It's like, hey, you're trying way too hard. We need to relax here. It's like some part of my mind knows this is not the way towards being present. And it's like the mind is trying to point out there's another way. So that's one thing that I just like to encourage, is check in the moment when you notice that mindfulness has returned. Check in. Is there more tension or more ease? Maybe unpleasant or pleasant. Just check into that, and then let yourself be aware of that. Just for a few moments. Really useful, because I think more often than not, more often than we might imagine, let's say more often than we might imagine, the state of mind when we wake up is because of that drifting. It's actually relaxed and at ease. And it's like we take that relaxation and ease and then can feed it back into our mindfulness. And yet, working with this active kind of thinking is a big part of our practice. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time to explore that tonight. couple pieces. Again, in the beginning, especially if the thinking has a kind of a reactive quality to it or an agitated quality to it, it's often helpful to, it's like what happens when we start thinking is our attention is going towards something we're reacting to. When we're in that kind of a reactive thought. So if the mind has wandered into a conversation with somebody that we were having a quarrel with, the thinking about that when we get lost in it, it's like we are attending to the idea that there was a problem or something that needed to be solved. How can I figure out what I should have said to that person? What can I do to change that situation? And so we're putting our attention on the what we think of as potentially the problem or what we are reacting to. And in mindfulness, what we often explore is turning back to how am I now in this experience? And so the first exploration is, as I said a few minutes ago, waking up into thinking, how am I now? How am I in this moment? It can be useful when you wake up into thinking to kind of acknowledge or recognize the basic flavor of thinking. So this is acknowledging the content a little bit. It's acknowledging the content of the thinking a little bit. There's two big categories that we tend to get involved in: past and future. And so remembering or planning or fantasizing. And yet, even in that, there can be various flavors. So, some that I'm familiar with: judging, arguing, analyzing is a big one for me. Analyzing, figuring out, searching, things like that. So there's just different flavors of patterns to our thinking. It can be really useful to kind of begin to look at those bigger categories. And you might begin to notice that your mind tends to certain categories. The story of poor me, or the story of I saved the day, or the disaster story, or the judging story, things like that. Just get familiar with the kinds of narratives that your mind produces. And if you notice some particularly familiar ones, it can be useful to have a kind of a name or a kind of a recognition, a way to recognize that kind of thought. So that it's essentially kind of taking a step back from the detail and recognizing, oh yeah, my mind is doing the disaster thing again. Or, oh yeah, my mind is doing the judging thing again. Or the planning thing again. Often when we're lost in the thought, it's the specifics we're caught in. And we can take a step back and notice the kind of category of thought. And so this is helping us to become aware of thought by stepping us back from the specifics, which is where the stickiness tends to be. And sometimes we can, it is possible as an exploration, if we see certain thoughts are really sticky, we see an argument in our mind, and it's like the mind keeps going back to the argument, and we can just maybe we can't stop that from happening. And this is another piece with mindfulness of thinking, is that we start to see just how out of control our minds are. We cannot flip a switch and say, stop thinking that thought, often. Especially with the sticky thought around an argument or something that's got an emotional charge to it. Often we can't just say, stop thinking that thought. And so we may, in order to be mindful of it, we may explore the possibility of, okay, yep, that argument is happening. Okay, arguing is happening. That's what's going on. The mind, so that there's a measure of awareness about the kind of thinking that's happening. A couple of other pieces that can be interesting to explore in noticing that we're thinking. This is a little bit separate from the content now, but who is our audience? Who are we talking to? Sometimes we're talking to ourselves, but sometimes we are expounding something to somebody. And that's interesting to notice sometimes. It's like, you're giving somebody a lecture, or or sometimes our thoughts, we are thinking about something as if somebody else is telling us something. So just notice, who's the audience? Who is the speaker? Who's the receiver of this conversation? And then another important piece, which I've referred to a few minutes ago, is the recognition that when there is a strong thought, when we charge out of the present moment in that way, when it's very active, usually there is emotion happening with that. This begins to point to a dynamic in our minds, a relationship between thoughts and emotions. When we think a thought, and we can see this in our meditation, when we think a thought, we're meditating, maybe we're just, breathing in, breathing out, noticing, hearing, and then suddenly we notice a sound that reminds us of something, and then we start thinking about that something, and then we start reacting to that something, and then we have anger, or frustration, or confusion. And so we can kind of see how sometimes as our mind wanders, it will create emotions. And so thoughts can generate emotions. Thoughts are actually pretty powerful. Let's just try this right now. I'll just close your eyes for a moment. Just take a moment to just check in. How are you in this moment? Connect with your breath. And now I'm going to drop some words into your meditation. And just see what happens as I say these words. Struggle. Confusion. Frustration. Calm. Ease. Peace. I'm curious, any comments? What did you notice with that? Just call it out, I'll repeat it. Yeah.
I guess it's onomatopoetic, just the sound quality of the words. Struggle is a very interesting calm.
Yeah. Was there any difference in the experience? Not particularly for you.
Well, the interest.
Interest, okay. Yeah, interest, yeah. Anybody else notice anything? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I've been struggling a lot with my thoughts on this for just a few seconds. The words help me really calm up. Just those few seconds that I've heard the words, calm, peace,
And it allowed you to calm down. Uh-huh.
which is something that I haven't been able to do myself.
Yeah.
Hearing the sound or the
The words. Yep.
reminded me that
Yep.
just as I came from a very a place of struggle when you were saying, I don't know how to do that.
So when I said the words struggle, frustration, were you experiencing something like that? Yeah. Anybody else notice something like that? Yep.
Yeah. Struggle, I felt struggle in my stomach or belly. There was one more negative one before you went to.
Frustration, confusion.
Felt here, like,
Yeah. Something wrong in the face. Yeah. Yeah.
it's just so funny how I was just paying attention to the body and just repeating the word in my mind there.
There it is. This is the power of thought. Some of you had a more dramatic experience of it than others, but this is a few words dropped into your meditation. A word, and there's a response. There can be a response to that. And just imagine how thinking the number of words that we think all day long can impact us. And so when we think thoughts, they do have this power to create our emotional reality in the moment. And so opening to that when we come back into mindfulness, very important exploration. So you've been lost in thought, to notice that this state of body, of mind, has been created. And often emotions have a bodily component to them, and so you can check in to the body too. This is, in a way, this is kind of like, it's an intermediate step with the thoughts, because you're not just saying, oh, thinking, coming back to the breath, but you're acknowledging this is the impact this thought has had on you. And this is powerful, this is helpful as we move towards practicing with thoughts in daily life, because as we take thoughts in, as we read news, as we hear news, as we have conversations, when we speak, when we think, we are continually responding to thoughts that are both coming in from the outside and thoughts that are here. And so if we learn the skill of opening to, oh wow, thinking has been happening, how am I having been thinking? It begins to open us to the possibility of being able to track that more dynamically in our lives. Being able to read a newspaper headline and know, ooh, how does that one land? Whew, clenching of the heart, fear, anxiety, or joy, excitement. Being able to be aware of how these things are landing for us. We're not trying to stop the emotions. We are trying to become aware of them. And then also, the other side of this, so this is a conditioned nature of our mind, cause and effect essentially. So thoughts will condition emotions. And emotions will condition thoughts. So it's a two-way street. We can see this if something happens to create, a frustration in our mind. So maybe just we hear something. This can happen kind of almost. It can almost happen subconsciously. Smell something, hear something that was associated with something that had an emotional response. Now there's often a flash of that as a memory. We may not see that in our awareness. There's usually some kind of thought that will precede the emotion. But then we're in that emotion. And so, maybe we haven't noticed that we've walked by a place where something smelled like something that had a bad impact on us when we were 5. And so we find ourselves frustrated or aversive maybe, just aversive. And then we're aversive, and it's like aversive. Oh, I'm feeling aversive, and like, why am I aversive? And there's like, then the mind will start looking for things to be averse about. So we can then that state of aversion or anger or frustration will start to generate thoughts. So it may be like something, sometimes we can see this. We can see how a thought will generate an emotion. And then we can subsequently see how that emotion, it's like when we find ourselves in an emotion, a reactive emotion, we often can see how it just spins thoughts out. It doesn't just stay with, oh yeah, I'm feeling angry. It's like we start trying to figure out how to fix the problem and make sure that the person doesn't do that to us again, or how can I get back at them? And so that the emotion tends to spin up more thoughts. So this dynamic between thoughts and emotions is really useful to get to know and to get familiar with. A really helpful tool is to ground in the emotions, ground in the bodily experience, not push away the thoughts. In a way that, when we have a thought storm, it's not pushing away the thoughts to come into the present moment around it, but it's also not jumping on the thoughts. So this is that dynamic that thing I talked about at the very beginning, the vast difference between being caught and engaged in the thought or pulled into the thought and knowing that we're thinking. This is that distinction, this is that difference, that when we begin to recognize, oh, this is thinking that's happening, and here's the emotion that's created, we are landing in the present moment, and we're no longer like in that pattern of being pulled into the thought. So this is also some of where I think the confusion around the idea that being mindful means letting go of thoughts or stopping thoughts somehow, because we are encouraged to notice that thoughts are happening, and that very action of noticing thoughts are happening takes us out of like jumping on the bandwagon of thoughts, continuing to think them, which tends to diminish the thoughts. So it's got a nice support for us. It provides a useful tool for us to step into the emotions. But it's not about ignoring or saying no to the thoughts. It's more about saying yes to, wow, the mind's been thinking, what's here? What's here as a result of that? Let's see. I'm going to, maybe I'll save the working with drifting thinking for next week. I want to talk a little bit more about how to work with thoughts when they're really strong, when it feels like we can't, just be mindful of them. I've had definitely times in my practice when thoughts are strong enough that trying to be mindful of them, I can do it for like half a second, and then I'm lost in the thought again. It's like, okay, pulled back, lost in the thought again. Even trying to be with the emotion sometimes. The emotion, if the emotion associated with those thoughts is so powerful, sometimes trying to be with the emotion is too close. And trying to be present for that emotion just pulls us back into the rabbit hole of that emotion and into the thoughts. And so how do we work with that? Well, first of all, it's helpful to recognize when that's happening. Is it possible to take the step back from the content, notice the kind of thinking? Is it possible to notice, wow, this is how that thinking has landed? Is it possible? Let yourself explore that to see if that's possible. See if the thinking does, this kind of active, charged thinking does diminish. If it's not possible, which often I see when I try to be mindful and it's like 3 or 4 times I get pulled back into the story of it. It's like, okay, maybe another approach. Couple of things. There's lots of tools actually the Buddha offered for this. One thing to reflect on, first of all, is just like, okay, what is this content? Is this content true? Is what I'm thinking about actually true? Sometimes if we can recognize, sometimes what we're thinking about is related to truth. It is related to what has happened or might happen. But often our minds will go off like the disasterizing, which my mind does at times. It's like, that is not true. Sometimes we can connect with recognizing what I'm thinking about is actually, there's no bearing in reality. And so that can be useful to notice. If the thinking is so powerful that we can't be mindful of it, the Buddha offered 5 tools. The first one is replacing the thought. Actually putting other thoughts in your mind. It's kind of like drowning it out with a louder radio. Something like that. Start thinking about something else. Try to think about something more wholesome usually. If you're caught in an argument with somebody, one of the kind of classic reflections is to think about things that are good about that person. Especially if it's a friend. Sometimes we get in arguments with friends and it's like we're stuck on that. It's like our mind is stuck in the groove thinking about, but they did that thing and and yet we can also remember, and I really appreciate this about that person and I really appreciate that about this person. So you can kind of just replace the thoughts with some other thoughts. So thinking thoughts of metta is one of the classic examples there. Bringing thoughts of goodwill into your mind. And if you can't bring thoughts of goodwill into your mind about the person or the situation that the mind is stuck on, bring thoughts of goodwill into your mind about some other situation. So that's the first thing he suggests. Just basically change the channel. Put different thoughts in your mind. Related to that, but maybe it doesn't have to be putting different thoughts into your mind. The second thing that he suggests is ignoring those thoughts. And so, often we don't think of that with our mindfulness. It's like, we think that mindfulness is about being present for something. But sometimes if something's really sticky like that, ignoring it can be useful. And this ignoring, to me, it's kind of like, it's not like you're telling it has to go away. It's not a repression. It's not a suppression. Sometimes I even will have like this little conversation in my mind. It's like, okay, yep, you can be there. You can stay in the room with me, but I'm going to pay attention to this right now. Often useful to pay attention to something neutral. And so this is, rather than putting different thoughts into your mind, I find sometimes switching the channel by just like saying, okay, yeah, that's happening, but, my feet are on the ground right now, and I can feel that. And my butt's on the chair, and I can feel that. Or I can see a tree, just something kind of neutral. So I call this changing the channel to kind of the neutral station. This is really useful if you can develop this skill. In my experience, the thoughts can't be too sticky to do this. It's because sometimes if the thoughts are really sticky, it's like you put your attention on something neutral, and it's like a magnet. It'll just go right back to the thing. But you can try several times. And sometimes I find the analogy of letting, sometimes it's like a kid that's asking for attention. And sometimes that's what our thoughts are, actually, is something saying something. Pay attention to me. Sometimes our thoughts are a signal of something that wants to be seen in us. And often it's related to the emotions connected with those thoughts that want to be seen. And so if we can't be with those thoughts, if we can't be mindful of them, then it's kind of like, a kid that wants to be seen, that's saying, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. And you have something else you need to do right now. It's like, sometimes you might say, hey, it's okay, I'll be here in this room with you, and I will get back to you in a few minutes. But right now, I have this to do. And so sometimes our thoughts may respond well to that kind of attitude in the mind, to that sense of, yes, I will get back to you, but right now I need to put my intention on something else. There were whole stretches of time for myself when I was working with anger and angry thoughts that I recognized that turning towards them was not helpful. This movement towards ignoring, putting the attention on something else, it's kind of like a strategy to gather your resources, to gather your strength, not so that you can ignore it forever, but so that you can come back and meet it at another time. So that's like gathering your strength to be able to meet it later. And so I actually found that making a bargain with it too. It's like, yeah, I will get back to you. And right now is not the time. I'm going to pay attention to my feet right now, or just my hands right now, or just seeing right now. So that's ignoring, using the ignoring. Then, again, if it's too sticky to be mindful of, all of these tools, in my understanding, are suggestions the Buddha offered when our thoughts are too strong to really just be mindful of. So the next one is attending to the drawbacks of these thoughts. It's like, this kind of thinking, has this served me in the past? Has it been helpful? Where is it heading? Where is this kind of thinking heading me? As we begin to explore with mindfulness the experience of reactive thoughts, we'll find that it doesn't feel very good. Reactive thoughts create this emotional turmoil, create a lot of agitation in the mind and in the heart, and it's unpleasant, actually. It's painful. It hurts to have that kind of reactive thinking happening. And so we can begin, as we begin to feel that, we begin to see at a very intimate way a different kind of drawback. It's not only the drawback of having the mind caught in an argument with somebody that you're not speaking to right now, but it's the drawback of the pain that we're experiencing in the moment. This is painful to do this right now. And there are actually ways to think about things that don't create that reactivity. This is some of what we learn as we explore becoming mindful of thoughts. We begin to see what kind of thoughts serve us and what kind of thoughts hurt us, create stress, create pain, create suffering. So, replacing thoughts, ignoring thoughts, attending to the drawbacks of thoughts. I'm going to skip the fourth one because it's kind of a complicated one. But the last one, I'm going to express is basically just say no. Just, it's kind of a strong response, as you might have to do, for instance, to a child. At one point, my nephew was enjoying himself running around the house, and it was at Thanksgiving, and most of us were seated at the table, and I had the view out into the living room, and so I could see my nephew running around, and he'd found a circuit that he could just run circles in the house. And at one point, he ran into the living room and ran straight towards the fireplace, full tilt. And I saw this, and I just screamed at him, "No, stop!" And he stopped. He stopped up short in time to not tumble into the fireplace. That kind of energy sometimes is necessary to prevent greater harm. Sometimes we just have to tell ourselves with a strong no, that is not helpful. I'm not going to go there. And the energy of that, it may have some aversion to it. It might well. I don't think the Buddha is suggesting have aversion to your thoughts in this description, because that strong energy of saying no can also come from clear compassion. That's like, really fierce compassion, as one teacher says, Rebecca Bradshaw. She says it's fierce compassion. You have to say no because you know it's heading towards suffering. And it can come out of compassion, that strong no. And yet, you don't have to wait. If you know that you have to say no to something, you don't have to wait for there not to be aversion, because sometimes, the aversion to that, like when I said no to my nephew, it wasn't just compassion. It was fear. There was fear there. I was not, just completely, this is what's happening. I was like, no, stop. And so there was both compassion in wanting to prevent the suffering, and there was some reactivity. There was some fear and some agitation of mind there. And it's like, I didn't say, let me wait until there's no agitation of mind to say no. Sometimes we have to act when there are mixed motivations. And likewise with the strong no, sometimes there will be both the understanding that, this is not the time, I cannot go there, it just heads me into a trapdoor that it takes days to get out of. When we see that we've got that kind of real stickiness, it may be useful to have a little bit of aversion to say no. And the connection with the compassion to also say no. So there's so much to talk about with working with thoughts. I feel like I've just skimmed the surface. But to be continued next week. Thank you for your attention.